so let's talk about the structure of the RFP. Now, I'm going to be talking about what we typically do here at the college. Again, other entities that you might be interested in might do things a little bit differently, but you're probably going to find very similar information in their solicitations as well. Maybe structured differently, but quite similar. So in our RFPs, we've divided them into two major sections. Section A, which is definitions and administrative requirements, and then Section B, which has, here's what we're looking for. As a vendor, you go to that Section B because that's got the meat and potatoes of what it is the college is looking for. What are we buying? What do we want the proponents to have? That's where it's all going to be, is in Section B. What I'm hoping we get out of today is that it's fine if you want to go and look first in Section B, don't blame me a bit. But at some point, you want to be reading Section A because it has all the terms and conditions of the RFP process that you have to agree to in order to participate. So you need to know what they are, what they say, and what it means to you. Now, these ones are the small print. It's in a couple of columns. Those of you that are familiar with RFP documents that the college has done or that ministries do, that's the terms and conditions of the RFP process. And there are a few clauses. I think there's 26 or 27 of them altogether now. But there's a few I wanted to point out just so that you have a good understanding of what they mean. The receipt confirmation form and posting addenda on BC Bid. Years ago, when I first started with purchasing services, back then it was the Purchasing Commission, we had a earlier version of BC Bid. And it was very limited on how many documents we could post with a single opportunity. I mean, it would be fine if we had like the RFP document and a couple of addenda, but after that it wouldn't support any more files being attached to it. So what we did in those days is that we had this receipt confirmation form that said that you could download the RFP off the website, and if you wanted to receive any of the addenda, you had to fill out that form and submit it to us, and then we would send directly to everyone who filled out one of those forms any subsequent addenda, which would be the answers to questions and whatever other information we needed to give you. And it became problematic. I can tell you of more than one afternoon where I had 40 odd of these receipt confirmation forms sent in and a 5-page addenda to send out back in the days before everybody had email addresses, and I would spend hours at a fax machine so that everybody got the information. And imagine if you submitted one of those receipt confirmation forms and it got lost. You know how you picked a bunch of stuff off the fax machine and somebody staples the last page and it's not theirs and they don't even notice? That happens sometimes, right? So you would send in a receipt confirmation form and the person running the RFP never got it, never knew you were interested. You never received any addenda, but your assumption would be, oh, I guess there aren't any. It became problematic. So with the new BC Bid system, we have an unlimited ability to post as many files as we want on a single opportunity. So most of us don't send out the addenda directly to vendors who say they're interested. We simply post on BC Bid, and we have language in there that says it's your responsibility to check the website for additional information. Really important thing that you do that. I have seen things like the closing location change. Having a look. If you didn't look to see the addenda, you wouldn't know that. Okay? So even though we do that, though, there's sometimes still a receipt confirmation form, which begs the question, why would we do that? Right? We don't need to know who you use as your courier or what your fax number is anymore, because we're going to post everything up on BC Bid. Some government entities, they just haven't thought it through all the way, and they've always had the receipt confirmation form, so it's still there. I know for myself, I include it if I have a proponents meeting, because I want to get a sense of how many people might be coming. And if I'm not having a proponents meeting, I get rid of it. That's just me personally. So you might still see that receipt confirmation form there. Occasionally, it's a mandatory requirement to fill it out and submit it while the RFP is open. And if that's the case, make sure you do that. Because remember, if you miss a mandatory, we can't consider your proposal. Okay? Late proposals. If your proposal comes in late, we're not going to accept it. We're not going to read it. Okay? So let's be clear on what late means. For the college, it says proposals must be received prior to, usually 2 p.m., on such and such a date. Prior to. That means 1:59:59 is okay, and 2 p.m. is not. And I tell you, it's that close. because there have been court cases where it has been a fraction of a second, and it has meant someone got sued because they accepted something they shouldn't have. So for you personally, I strongly recommend that you have a closing date on any RFP you're working on that's a couple of days ahead of the real one. Then if something goes horribly wrong, you have time to fix it. Okay? Because if you submit late, and it doesn't matter what the reason is. Good example of this is we had RFP that closed. This was in Victoria on a day where there was a windstorm and somebody couldn't catch the ferries. None of the ferries were running. It was late. It was not accepted. Doesn't matter what the reason is. Now, having said that, though, sometimes we will globally extend closing dates. 9/11 is a good example of this. 9/11 happened, and we knew that there was like no-fly zones for those first few days right after 9/11. And so on BC bid, the decision was made that anything that was closing within a couple of days of that date, we just extended. We told everybody that's what we were doing because there was no way that the couriers and such were going to make it there with no-fly zones the way they were at 9/11. Okay? But when that happens, it happens before the closing time. It might be right before, but it is before. Once that closing date and time hits, it's done. And if your proposal's not in, there's nothing we can do for no matter what the reason is that it didn't make it on time. And I've heard tons, everything from the courier absolutely promised me to I'm stuck in the ferry traffic to you name it. You know, you hear everything. So I will give you a bit of advice though. I'll give you a strategy on what you can do if you're putting your proposal together and the world falls apart at the last minute and there's no way you're going to get it to the closing location on time. I do have a little trick that might be useful. You can, now in this case, we're not accepting e-bids on the BC bid system. It has to be hard copies delivered to the college. And you can't send it by email. Mandatories are very clear. No emails, no faxes. So you can send your proposal to a nearby company, I would suggest like a printing company, and authorize them to sign it on your behalf. Remembering you need that original signature. We're not going to check the signature, but you want to have some sort of paper trail within your organization that says you're authorizing this individual to sign on your behalf. You send an email to them with your files. Get them to print it off in the appropriate number of copies. Give them authority to sign that front cover page for you and run it over to the closing location. So you want to pick a print shop that's real close to wherever the closing location is, and you can do that. As long as it gets to the closing location on time, the fact that you did it in that way makes no difference to us. We're going to be looking that all the mandatories were met, including number of copies and signatures and all the rest of it, and you would have made it doing it that way. Okay. Now here for the college, most vendors are in the Lower Mainland. You know, they're not that far, but that's not always the case. You know, it could be that for whatever reason, you know, computer problems, glitches, you just haven't got time to come in from over town where your company is to where our closing location is. This is a strategy you can use. Whether it's us or someone else, you can use this. Which is why e-bidding is so nice for those that allow it. You don't have to worry about couriers or collating or any of that.
So, sorry, I'm just trying to let that information sink in deeply. So, when you're mentioning for the closest printing location, it is for any event in which is close to the deadline, or just for the 9/11/11?
No, this is a strategy that you can use if something has happened to you personally where you're afraid you're not going to make the closing date in time. From our perspective, we are looking for the mandatories to be met. And if you have done it in this way, you know, as long as we've got the number of copies on time, original signature, we're going to accept it.
Within the borders, then that's okay.
That's what we want. Whatever the mandatories say, did you meet them or not? Right. Okay. Of course, if you do that and someone forgets to sign, then the mandatory is not met. Yeah. Okay, so that's just a strategy for you. Now let's say that you're a forward-thinking vendor and you submit your proposal a few days early. You know, you got it done, you got it in a few days early, and then something comes up and you need to change something. Okay, something has come up within your organization, or maybe an addendum was posted last minute that made a difference to your proposal. You can do changes to your proposal as often as you like up until the closing date and time. Okay, whatever you want to change, totally up to you. You can withdraw your whole proposal if you want to. Entirely up to you. Yes?
Is there a cutoff date that the government or your office will post amended?
Good question.
I mean, they do it 30 seconds before the closing date. What
Yeah.
does that mean?
In most RFPs, I mean, every organization is a bit different. In most RFPs, though, they do have some standard language that says if how you ask questions. You send them in writing to the contact person, and it'll say something like, if time permits, answers will be provided as addenda on the BC Bid website. And that word "as time permits" is for exactly that. The last day of closing, some question comes in, and we just don't have time to answer it. Because by the time we get an answer, and then we post it up on BC Bid, and all the vendors have a chance to read it and figure out, what does this mean for my proposal? Make whatever changes that they might need to make to their proposal. I mean, all that takes some time. Okay, so we sometimes, when a question comes in really late, we just might respond directly to that vendor saying, sorry, we're not answering. We don't have time. Okay? Some RFPs have a cutoff date for questions. All questions must be received by such and such a date. And that's to exactly manage this process so that we can provide answers with enough time for the vendors to incorporate that into their proposals. Me personally, I hate cutoff times for questions. Because let's say my cutoff time is all questions must be received no later than 7 days prior to closing. Okay? So does that mean at 2 p.m. 7 days prior, or if I got something at 4 o'clock, that would be okay? And what happens if you get the fabulous question 5 days before closing, the kind of thing that you kind of go, why didn't I think of that? Oh, of course everybody needs to know that. Does that mean I can't answer that now? Those are the dilemmas that it causes me. I much prefer to use that generic language. And then if I get the really great question that comes in, a day or two before closing, one of the options that we have is to provide an answer and extend the closing date to give people time to incorporate that information. On the other hand, if I get a question that I think, yeah, but it's not going to make a huge difference in proposals, and it's the last few days before closing, I can just say, sorry, we don't have time to answer that. And you don't get an answer at all.
Your office will not contact the people who already filed.
No.
So
No.
it's on us.
It's on you, yes. So if you've sent in your proposal early, pay attention to the BC Bid website. Make sure nothing has changed that might impact what you've submitted. And if it does, if something happens, that either within your organization or another addendum gets posted and it changes things, you can make any change you like up until the closing date and time. A couple of caveats, though, with this one. Number one, you may want to ask if it has to be submitted the same way your original proposal did. Original signature and so many copies, hand-delivered or couriered. Okay? Because sometimes if it's like a 2-page addendum or amendment to your proposal, a fax might be accepted, but I would not say that as a global thing. You'd need to ask for each opportunity to see. And of course the worry is if we said, yes, you can do faxed amendments, and then everybody sends in their faxed amendments at 10 to 2 on the closing date, good chance your amendment won't be able to make it through. And that's the worry. And the other worry is we don't want to get the 5-page proposal and then the 200-page faxed amendment to it, right? That's another thing we're trying to avoid. So you want to find that out. And the other thing, be very explicit on what the change is. So if you're giving us a change that says remove this section and replace it with this, be very explicit. Add this to section such and such of our proposal, fine, we can do that. We'll do whatever it is you tell us to do, but you need to be clear on what you want us to do. It can be very difficult if the instructions on a change are not clear. What are we supposed to do with this? So be really clear on what you want us to do, and we'll do whatever you tell us. Then there's the lobbying clause in the standard RFP. And the lobbying clause says, proponents must not attempt to communicate directly or indirectly with any employee, contractor, or representative of VCC, including the evaluation committee, or with members of the public or the media about the project described in this request for proposals, or otherwise in respect of the request for proposals other than as expressly directed or permitted by VCC. That's the language that's in the no lobbying clause. You agree to it when you submit a proposal. But let's be clear on what it means. This means that we don't want you coming to employees of the college, or if you happen to know who the evaluation team, or you're guessing who they might be, we don't want you going directly to them. We also don't want you going to elected officials. Because think of it this way. Let's say that you submitted a proposal and you were unsuccessful. You submitted a proposal and you were our highest scoring proponent. And then you find out that we got a letter from the MLA of his jurisdiction saying that he's the best thing since sliced bread and he should win this RFP. What are you going to think? Was this a fair process? Did the politicians maybe influence us in this in our decision making? I mean, even if that never happened, that's what you're going to think. There's going to be that perception of political interference. And we don't want that. So we don't want to hear from any elected officials about how wonderful you are, because we don't want any perception of political interference. Okay? What that clause does not mean, because it's worded very broadly, this has been brought to my attention in the past, it does not mean you are unable to discuss the RFP with some other vendor that you want to partner with. You want them to be your sub, or you want to be a sub to them, you go ahead and have those conversations. If you've got an RFP that is asking you for your credit situation and you got to talk to your bank about that, yeah, you can go ahead and do that. It's not intended to stop you from doing the conversations and the contacts you need to do to put your proposal together. What it's intended to stop is any real or perceived interference with a fair, open, and transparent process.
So what happens if the MLA writes a letter saying that the vendor is the perfect person for the
Yeah,
job?
I've
Does
had it
that
happen.
Vendor get his proposal taken away, or?
The language in here doesn't say that that's what would happen. I can tell you that in the past, it hasn't happened often, but it has happened, and then what goes on then is that that letter has to be expressly not considered. I mean, we have to document that we got it and it's not being considered or influencing in any way. All the evaluators have to sign off on that. And then there's usually follow-up with that MLA as to why this really caused us severe problems, and maybe they shouldn't do that on open competitions.
Forgive me, this may be a very inconvenient question, but I feel the need to at least probe for some leverage. You mentioned the interference and the interruptions. Now, we're talking BCB, that's web-based. Web-based, when it's interrupted, means that there's an overload of traffic and the web is down. I've noticed that in our current reality, there's some preference or some fashion for certain numbers, like 1 p.m. or 3 p.m. or 11 p.m. So if I were to submit a proposal, I would be a little bit more inclined to pay attention to the timing where I'm submitting, even if it's way in advance, on a specific date and a specific hour. So is the government, for whatever story design purposes, are you regulating web traffic at certain hours? So for example, if there's 100 vendors willing to propose a submission, and the number that is magic is 25 or 40, does that mean that out of 100, maybe 40 are going to get it in at 1 o'clock and 60 are going to drop down? Or
No.
like, is there a traffic
No.
reglementation?
Um,
China can
Yeah, what I can
censor
tell you.
Google, so anything can be done.
Yeah, I've been here, the dozen years that I've been involved with BC Bid. There has never been an issue that has stopped submissions coming in, e-bids coming in, because of excessive traffic. Now, having said that, there are some opportunities that get posted where we're expecting hundreds of submissions. And in those cases, we do have a discussion with our executive director about how that might be managed. And there's lots of options. So we might have it as no other e-bids are closing, or limiting the number of e-bids that are closing on that day. We might have it where maybe we don't allow e-bids on that one because we know there's going to be such large submissions. We don't want to be blocking up the traffic that way. But I can't think of a single instance where BC Bid went down because of the traffic overload. And the reality is there's a lot of organizations that post on there. Some of them, I know in our office and here at the college, 2 p.m. is a very common time. That's not for everybody though. I've seen lots that are at 1 or at noon or at 4:30, whatever. Generally speaking though, what happens on one particular day, every RFP will, you'll have, some of them have 2 or 3 submissions. Some of them I've seen a high of maybe 40. You don't often get more than that on any given day. And when we're anticipating it, we do plan for that. Hasn't happened yet. If it were to happen, well, we'll see what happens then. Because I mean, it's just, the reality would be if you're not able to submit because the BC Bid system goes down, then there needs to be something else, because that's totally outside the control of the vendors that the BC Bid site went down. Having said that though, I will tell you that my experience is the majority of proposals that come in on an RFP come in the last hour. You can do yourself a huge favor if yours comes in earlier than that. That last hour is a really busy time. And in offices like here at the college, for example, we have established processes so that we're sure if yours comes in on time, it's appropriately marked as being on time. Same is true in my Victoria office. Lots of people, though, that post RFPs, I don't know what their processes are, how established they are.